Hi, this is Dr. Perry Carpenter. I'd like to thank you for taking the time to join me on today's video. On today's video, I want to share some material with you regarding the formal gait analysis. The formal gait analysis. And this material is extracted from a 6-hour QME continuing education home study program that's entitled The 21 Secrets of the Most Persuasive QMEs. And before I get into today's material regarding gait disturbance, and permanent impairments associated with gait disturbances, I want to tell you a little bit about this program, the 21 Secrets of the Most Persuasive QMEs. Now, this program is a 6-hour QME continuing education home study program, and it's been in publication for about 18 months. And in that time, it has become our most popular QME continuing education home study program. And since the very first date that it was published, I've received numerous requests, and the requests are ongoing, from doctors who are asking for additional elaboration on some of the ideas that are discussed in that program. And that's the purpose of today's video, is to elaborate on one of the ideas contained within that program, and that idea has to do with the formal gait analysis. Now, the research in putting together this program goes back over a decade. Actually, I began researching this material back in 2003 and 2004, and it really accelerated in 2005 with the passage of Senate Bill 899 and the adoption of the AMA guides. And during this period of time, I began to ramp up my education, and I started to attend more conventions and seminars and workshops, and throughout this time I was able to listen to and consult with and mastermind with some of the most persuasive and most highly respected qualified medical evaluators of all specialties in the entire state of California. And in each interaction, I managed to extract some valuable notes regarding practices and principles and procedures that these highly respected and influential qualified medical evaluators all shared in common in the preparation of their QME reports. And so I took these notes and I started to assemble them, and I finally assembled them into a 6-hour continuing education home study program. And in researching this material, I found that the best secrets, the best practices, and the best procedures used by the very best evaluators in the entire state parceled themselves out into 4 basic categories. There were those practices and procedures that the best evaluators did even before meeting in the face-to-face evaluation with the injured worker. And I entitled those secrets, I entitled those the preparatory secrets of the most persuasive QMEs. And then there were those practices and procedures and principles that the very best evaluators used while in the face-to-face evaluation with the injured worker, and I entitled those secrets the interview and examination secrets of the most persuasive QMEs. And then there were those procedures that the very best evaluators did after the face-to-face meeting with the injured worker in the preparation of their final report, and I entitled those secrets the report writing secrets of the most persuasive QMEs. And then finally, there were those procedures and practices and principles and philosophies and beliefs all shared by the very best evaluators with regards to depositions. And so I assembled all of those, and I entitled those the deposition secrets of the most persuasive QMEs. So we had the preparatory secrets, the interview and examination secrets, the report writing secrets, and the deposition secrets of the most persuasive QMEs. And for those of you that have been following this video series, you know by now that I fully elaborated on and created separate and distinct individual videos elaborating on all of the preparatory secrets And we're now most of the way through of the interview and examination secrets. And I want to share with you today one of those interview and examination secrets regarding the formal gait analysis. So our agenda for today is twofold. I want to spend the first part of the video talking to you about, number one, the necessity of the formal gait analysis. And we'll establish the necessity of integrating some sort of a formal procedure, some sort of a definite observation of the gait during your actual physical examination with your examinee. And then in the second half of the video, I'm going to give you a practical approach or a practical procedure that you can use with your very next examinee if it's appropriate to do a formal gait analysis. And you're going to find that this procedure is very simple to do. It takes no time at all, and it's actually quite fun to do. I myself have done hundreds of formal gait analyses over the past decade, and I have found it to be never cumbersome, never burdensome. It's always fun to do, and it gives invaluable information when it comes time to provide your opinion on either the presence of or the absence of permanent impairment due to gait disturbance. So we're going to go through the AMA guides, and we're going to touch upon several chapters in the AMA guides. We'll begin in chapter 1 and talk about the activities of daily living as those activities relate to gait and gait disturbances. Then we'll talk a little bit about some of the different types of gait disturbances that are discussed in chapters 13, chapter 15, and chapter 17. We'll talk about the pain-related impairment as it relates to gait disturbance in chapter 18. And we'll specifically focus on some of the pain behaviors that revolve around disturbances in gait. And you're going to find this to be a fascinating discussion as we integrate many chapters in the AMA guides and synthesize all of these different ideas into one compound idea, which involves the gait analysis for the detection and determination of permanent impairment due to gait disturbance. So you're going to need your AMA guides. I'll give you a minute to go ahead and get your AMA guides. I'll grab my AMA guides, and I look forward to being right back with you in just a moment as we delve into the formal gait analysis. Okay, I'm back with you now, and I have my AMA guides with me. I hope you have your AMA guides with you as well, because I want to go over several passages from the AMA guides, and it's going to be helpful to you if you can actually look at the actual references from the AMA guides. So I want to spend some time with you now in part 1 of this video talking about the necessity of the formal gait analysis. I want to spend some time on this because I found in speaking with doctors that not all doctors do a formal gait analysis, and yet many doctors are providing for permanent impairment due to gait disturbance, either directly or indirectly by analogy to Alvarez-Guzman 2. And so doctors are providing for permanent impairment due to gait disturbance, and yet their evidence that supports a permanent impairment for gait disturbance, in my opinion, is not substantial. And I want to take you through several different thoughts and several different philosophies and then several different procedures to help you elevate and escalate your conclusions and opinions to the level that actually qualify as substantial medical evidence. Now, just to reiterate some of the philosophy of this program is extracted from a 6-hour continuing education program entitled The 21 Secrets of the Most Persuasive QMEs. Persuasive is the operative word in that title. So what does it mean to be persuasive? What we're after is we're after producing QME reports, medical legal reports, that are persuasive. What should they be persuasive for? Well, they should be persuasive for our opinions and conclusions, and they should present our opinions and conclusions in such a way that our opinions and conclusions are irrefutably substantiated. Now, I want you to relax a little bit because I need you to know that we're not required to actually have correct opinions and conclusions all the time. In other words, you can provide an opinion or a conclusion that could be wrong, but that's okay as long as you substantiate your opinion and conclusions. The parties can then use those in arriving at their own arguments. So our opinions and conclusions need to be substantiated, and they need to be substantial. They need to be what's referred to as substantial medical evidence. And it needs to be persuasive. So when you provide for permanent impairment due to gait disturbance, you need to substantiate it with positive objective findings. We'll talk about some of the positive objective findings. And your positive objective findings need to be substantiated by your physical examination procedures. And I'm here to recommend to you that you adopt a specific procedure regarding gait, and we're referring to that specific procedure as the formal gait analysis. Okay? So I want to encourage you to adopt some form of a formal gait analysis in your regular examination protocol. I'm going to give you some ideas on that as we go along. But let's begin in Chapter 1 of the AMA Guides, and let's talk about some of the activities of daily living as they relate to gait and gait disturbances. Okay, so on page 4, right in the very beginning of the book, Table 1.2 talks about some of the activities of daily living. So I just want to review these. And I want to show you that many of these activities of daily living has something to do with gait. Okay? So let's talk about the activities of daily living. There's 8 different categories of activities of daily living. There's self-care and personal hygiene. There's communication activities. There are physical activities. There are sensory function activities. There are non-specialized hand activities. There are travel activities, sexual function activities, and sleep activities. And within each of these categories of activities of daily living, there are many different sub-activities contained within that category. So for example, self-care and personal hygiene includes, for example, urinating, defecating, brushing teeth, combing hair, bathing, dressing oneself, and eating. So a couple points about this before we get into gait. The AMA guides provide for us in Table 1.2 some representative activities of daily living that the AMA guides consider to be important that we consider in arriving at our conclusions for permanent impairment. But these are not the only activities of daily living that exist, and these are not the only activities of daily living that we should explore as qualified medical evaluators. So we have latitude and we actually have an obligation to explore additional activities that may not be listed specifically in this table, but other activities that are adversely impacted by the examinee's injury or condition. So in each one of these categories of activities of daily living, after each of the sub-activities, I want you to include the sub-activity of quote-unquote other activities. So, for example, with regards to self-care and personal hygiene, after you explore with your examinee their ability to urinate, defecate, brush their teeth, comb their hair, bathe, dress themselves, and feed themselves, you could simply ask them, Mrs. Jones, are there any other limitations that you have with your self-care and personal hygiene? So always add another and other list of activities to allow the examinee to expand upon the activities that are listed here. This is just a representative list. It's not the entire list. Okay? So another thing about activities of daily living that I want to share with you, and that is this sometimes comes as a novel idea to doctors. And that is that it's my opinion, and I've talked about this in other videos, and I go into this in great detail in the program, the 21 Secrets program. But it's my opinion that the activities of daily living assessment should be done in the face-to-face evaluation with the injured worker. Okay? Now, if it's not done in the face-to-face evaluation with the injured worker, how else could it be done? Well, I found that many doctors do an activities of daily living assessment simply by having the examinee complete a checkbox form wherein they indicate different activities that they're having trouble with as a result of their injury or condition. And it's my opinion that a checkbox form is okay, as long as you then take the time in the face-to-face evaluation to review the activities of daily living check sheet and explore each of those activities that the examinee has checked. I prefer to do the activities of daily living assessment as an interview process in the face-to-face evaluation with the injured worker, and I'm going to demonstrate that to you as regards gait and gait disturbances. So in table 1.2, as we go down the activities of daily living categories, category number 3 is entitled the physical activities. And some of the physical activities that the AMA guides describe include standing, sitting, reclining, walking, and climbing stairs. That's 5 physical activities. Now, those are not the only physical activities that people engage in. So, always explore other activities that may be adversely impacted in your examinee. What would some of those other things be? How about running? How about jumping? How about hopping? How about bending and picking up from the floor? It's not listed here in any other category. You could include that in the physical activities. So always explore additional activities beyond those that are simply listed here. This is simply a representative list, and you should fully give your examinee the opportunity to explain to you any limitations they're having with any activities of daily living. Okay? Well, within category number 3, the physical activities, this is where we start to see our first indication that the examinee could be impacted by gait. So one of the activities, or I should say sub-activities listed in category number 3, the physical activities, is walking. So during your activities of daily living interview with the examinee, you would be inquiring with them about whether or not they have any difficulty or limitation with their ability to be able to walk. Okay? Now, let's expand upon the physical activity of walking and see what the AMA guides require that we investigate with regards to their ability to walk. Okay? Well, we know in chapter 13 which is table 1315, the central nervous system chapter, central and peripheral nervous system chapter. The AMA guides provide for permanent impairment due to gait disturbance due to either a central nervous system disorder or a disorder with the peripheral nervous system. And here, gait is, they call it station and gait. And gait is broken down into several areas that require our investigation. So for example, the class 1 impairments include a person who is able to rise to a standing position. They can walk, but they have difficulty with elevations, grades, stairs, deep chairs, and long distances. A class 2 impairment is a person who can rise to a standing position, who can walk some distance with difficulty and without assistance, but is limited to level surfaces. So let's just stop right there and take those two examples. Your inquiry into your examinee's activities of daily living as relates to their ability to walk should explore those different types of walking activities. So that might go something like as follows. Mrs. Jones, I'm going to ask you some questions about the impact of your injury or condition on your ability to walk. Now, Mrs. Jones, as a result of your lower back pain, do you have any difficulty with walking up elevations? Do you have any difficulty with walking up grades? Do you have any difficulty with rising from a deep chair? Do you have any difficulty with stairs? Do you have any difficulty with distances? Now, what your examinee is going to report to you could vary. There's 1,000 different responses to those questions, and we can just imagine most of them. But regardless of what the examinee tells you, that they're having some difficulty, those reports of difficulties are subjective. They're subjective, correct? In other words, we have no capacity to be able to determine if the examinee has difficulty with long distances, because we don't have the capacity to examine for that in the limited context of the QME evaluation, correct? We have no way to verify if the examinee has any difficulty with elevations, correct? We have no difficulty with, we have no capacity to verify if the examinee is having difficulty with walking up grades, okay? Thus, it's necessary for us to at least do some type of a formal gait analysis to determine the presence of any type of gait disturbance. Otherwise, we cannot simply accept their subjective reports without associated objective findings. Now, associated objective findings are even more critical when we get into Chapter 17. In Chapter 17, this is out of Table 17-5. Chapter 17 requires hard objective evidence of degenerative change of the joints before the examinee qualifies for permanent impairment. So in Chapter 17, in addition to having positive objective findings on physical examination, Chapter 17 requires that the examinee have positive radiographic findings for degenerative change of the joints, of the lower extremity joints. So in Table 17-5, the impairments are listed as mild impairments, moderate impairments, and severe impairments. So, for example, a mild impairment includes an antalgic limp with a shortened stance phase. Antalgic limp with a shortened stance phase. Another mild impairment is a positive Trendelenburg sign. And a third, another mild impairment, the third mild impairment, is that the individual requires part-time use of a cane or crutch for distance walking, but not usually at home or in the workplace. So chapter 17, at least as regards the mild impairments, requires that we observe the gait. It requires that we observe the gait. In chapter 13, I'm suggesting that we must observe the gait. Chapter 17 actually requires that we observe the gait, that we be able to substantiate that we observed an antalgic limp with shortened stance phase, that we observed a Trendelenburg sign, or that we observed the examinee to require the part-time use of a cane or crutch. How are you going to do that in the absence of a formal gait analysis? Thus, the necessity of doing some sort of a formal gait analysis. It's my opinion that it's simply not enough to watch the examinee move around the office. That's too limited of a setting to be able to substantiate these findings. Okay? Well, let's continue. Let's continue with this theme of the necessity of the formal gait analysis. So we talked about activities of daily living. Well, also during the QME interview, many doctors have the examinee fill out what we refer to as symptom questionnaires. And there's a variety of different types of symptom questionnaires that we use, and you're all familiar with those. We use the Neck Disability Index, we use the Beck Depression Inventory, and the DASH questionnaire, and all these different symptom questionnaires. Well, I want to review with you a couple of different symptom questionnaires and explore with you how these symptom questionnaires lead naturally to the formal gait analysis. Okay? So the first one I want to share with you is the Revised Oswestry Low Back Pain Questionnaire. The Low Back Pain Questionnaire. In section 4 of this questionnaire, it specifically asks how their back pain affects them in their ability to walk. So for example, some of the responses that are options on the Oswestry Low Back Questionnaire include: number 1, I have no pain on walking. Number 2, I have some pain on walking, but it does not increase with distance. Okay? Those would be two examples of no gait disturbance, absence of gait disturbance. One is I have no pain on walking. Number 2 is I have some pain on walking, but it does not increase with distance, and therefore, because it does not increase with distance, it does not interfere with the ability to walk for distance, and so therefore would not qualify as a gait disturbance. Number 3 is I cannot walk more than 1 mile without increasing pain. Number 4, I cannot walk more than 1/2 mile without increasing pain. Number 5, I cannot walk more than 1/4 mile without increasing pain. And number 6, I cannot walk at all without increasing pain. So if you have an examinee who checks the box and says, I cannot walk at all without increasing pain, it's my opinion that that should be substantiated, number 1, by positive objective findings on clinical exam, and number 2, by positive objective findings on the formal gait analysis. Well, what about this questionnaire, the Lower Extremity Functional Scale? This is a questionnaire that we use for any type of a lower extremity involvement, such as a hip injury, such as a knee injury, etc. So this questionnaire revolves very heavily around gait. So for example, the questionnaire asks us, today, do you or would you have any difficulty with any of the following activities? Number 1, any of your usual work, housework, or school activities. Well, what are some of your usual work, housework, and school activities? Generally those involve walking, correct? Going around and doing your household activities involves walking. Usual work activities involve walking. How about any of your usual hobbies, recreational or sporting activities? How could a gait disturbance interfere with sporting activities? Well, it could make it impossible to run, could make it impossible to stop, start, cut, change direction, perform agility, correct? How about here? The questionnaire specifically asks, because of your lower extremity condition, do you have any difficulty walking between rooms? If the examinee indicates that they have difficulty walking between rooms, that's something that should be substantiated by a formal gait analysis. And then the questionnaire gets right into other specific walking activities. It asks, do you have any difficulty walking 2 blocks? Do you have difficulty walking a mile? Do you have difficulty running on uneven ground? Do you have difficulty running on even ground? So positive responses to these questions spark the need and lead naturally into some sort of a formal gait analysis in your physical examination. Okay, finally, in Chapter 18, when it comes to providing for additional permanent impairment, additional discretionary permanent impairment due to pain, Chapter 18 provides for us a very specific pain impairment analysis procedure. Part of that procedure involves having the examinee fill out a questionnaire entitled the Pain-Related Impairment Questionnaire. Now this questionnaire is divided into 3 sections. Section number 2 is entitled the Activity Limitation or Interference. So what section 2 of this questionnaire does is it asks the examinee to tell us how their pain interferes with various activities. And the very first activity that it inquires about is the ability to walk. The ability to walk. Isn't that incredible how gait disturbance is threaded throughout all these themes, including here in Chapter 18. So the question is simply asks, how much does your pain interfere with your ability to walk 1 block? Think about that, 1 block. A very small window of walking. And responses range all the way from 0, which means it does not restrict the ability to walk 1 block at all the way to number 10, which suggests that the pain makes it impossible for me to walk 1 block. Now, I want you to imagine in your mind an examinee who circles, say, for example, number 5, midway through the range between does not interfere or does not restrict the ability to walk and it's impossible to walk. Your examinee selects a number 5, indicating that he has significant difficulty being able to walk 1 block. What would that examinee look like? What would someone who has significant difficulty walking 1 block, how would they present if you were to go outside and watch them walk? What is significant difficulty walking 1 block? Is that a person that would have to stop after 20 steps and take a break? Is that someone who would have to sit down? In other words, they're able to walk a block, but they're having significant difficulty. What is significant difficulty? Is a person who walks a block with pain, is that significant difficulty? That is not significant difficulty. What is significant difficulty? I want you to picture that in your mind. And so when an examinee indicates a positive finding on this question, a positive response to this question, that's something that needs to be verified by physical examination findings, because their response to this question is completely subjective. It's completely subjective and does not qualify as substantial evidence upon which you can opine for permanent impairment due to gait disturbance. Thus, another indication of the necessity of the formal gait analysis. Okay? Now, before we get off this point and get into the formal gait analysis, I just want to really drive this nail finally into the ground on this topic. With regards to the pain-related impairment assessment in Chapter 18, we use this questionnaire. Well, one of the other components of the pain impairment analysis is us as the doctor making an observation as to the examinee's pain behaviors. And I talk in great detail on pain behaviors in another video, and you can find that on my website. It's simply entitled Pain Behaviors. And I talk about the pain behaviors for about an hour. Okay? So what's amazing is that the AMA guides on page 580 describe some pain behaviors that are typical positive objective findings in the presence of bona fide medical conditions. Now, like the activities of daily living, the pain behaviors that are listed on page 580 are not the only pain behaviors that we can consider. And we should consider the entire constellation of pain behaviors that examinees could present with. But the AMA guides give us a starting point, and they give us several different pain behaviors to consider, many of which are related to gait. So let's just go down the pain behaviors as they're listed on page 580 and consider those that are associated with gait. Okay, so the first pain behavior described is facial grimacing. Okay, now I guess you could have facial grimacing with gait, but that's not specifically relating to gait. The next one, number 2, is holding or supporting an affected body part or area. Now, is that a pain behavior that could manifest itself during gait? Yeah, it could, couldn't it? It could. You ever seen an examinee walking with their hands on their back, for example? That could be an example. Okay? So that's something that we could verify by a formal gait analysis, by observation during a formal examination procedure. Number 3, limping or distorted gait. If you observe the pain behavior of limping or distorted gait, limping and distorted gait is a positive objective finding for some physical condition. So that is something that you would want to explore in your physical examination. When you see this pain behavior, someone limping, that tells you that something's wrong, that needs to be explored by physical examination. Thus the necessity of the formal gait analysis. How about moving in a guarded or protective fashion? Imagine someone moving and walking very carefully so as not to jostle anything. That's something that you could observe with a formal gait analysis. How about using a cane or other assistive device? If you see an examinee present to the evaluation with a cane, you would then want to observe them using that cane, correct? You would want to observe their use of the cane in actual gait in order to determine that the cane is being used properly, to be able to determine that the cane is fit properly, and to be able to determine that the cane is indeed a medically necessary device under the workers' compensation claim, and that the cane is actually helping them and not making them worse. And a cane improperly used can actually make a person worse. So you would want to observe the examinee to use their cane in a formal gait analysis. Finally, what about pain behavior number 10, stooping while walking? It talks about stooping while walking, a gait disturbance. If you see stooping while walking, that's a positive objective finding that you should explore by physical examination in what we're referring to now as a new procedure entitled the formal gait analysis. Okay, doctors? So, I hope we've established that it's necessary to do a formal gait analysis. Many doctors don't do any kind of a formal gait analysis, but in my opinion, it's required. And it's specifically required in Chapter 17. Chapter 17 describes gait derangement as one of the impairments associated with lower extremity injuries. Because it's one of the impairments, it's something that we need to examine for. We as qualified medical evaluators need to either rule in or rule out the presence or absence of gait derangement in assessing the examinee for lower extremity permanent impairments. So with all lower extremity cases, I mean, I'm sure there's a couple of exceptions, but with lower extremity cases, we have a series of impairments that the AMA guides require that we assess for. Okay, and those are all listed in Chapter 17, one of which is gait derangement. It's required that we assess for it. How are we going to assess for it? Well, I'm going to talk about that procedure coming up in just a couple minutes. And in just a couple minutes, we'll get into a practical procedure that you can use and that you can implement in your very next examination. Okay, so I hope now you're in agreement with me that some sort of formal gait assessment or formal gait analysis is required during your physical examination for those examinees who have lower extremity injuries, who have spinal injuries, or who have injuries to either the central or peripheral nervous systems. Some sort of a gait analysis is required if you're going to provide for permanent impairment due to gait disturbance and or the need for assistive devices. So if you're in agreement with me on that, you might be wondering, well, okay, how do I do a formal gait analysis? Well, it's quite interesting because while the AMA guides allow us to provide for permanent impairment due to gait disturbances, nowhere in the AMA guides do they tell us how to assess for gait. There's not one sentence in the AMA guides, if I'm not mistaken, there's not one sentence that describes any type of physical examination procedure or any type of procedure at all for the observation of the gait. So how do you do it? Well, I want to share with you now a procedure that I've used myself hundreds of times. And when I first started doing my gait analysis, I didn't include all of these steps that I'm going to share with you now, but it evolved into these 5 steps that I'm going to share with you. And these 5 steps really simplify the procedure and streamline the procedure and make it easy to do and make it reproducible from examinee to examinee. And I've done this procedure hundreds of times, and I'll share more about that with you as we go. So the 5 steps to the formal gait analysis that I want to share with you now include step number 1, observe. Step number 2, interrogate. Step number 3, define. Step number 4, videotape. And step number 5 is review. Observe, interrogate, define, videotape, and review. And I'll go over each one of these in some detail with you now. So let's talk about step number 1, which is to observe. Your observation of the examinee begins when you meet the examinee in the waiting room. Now, when you meet the examinee in the waiting room, you want to observe for a couple of things. A couple of things that you want to sharpen your attention for. Number one would be the presence or absence of any type of an assistive device. Now, it's not easy to overlook a cane or a crutch or a walker or some other device like that, but not all assistive devices are visible. Sometimes assistive devices are covered up by the clothing, and you may discover those later on in the physical examination, but at least initially you want to be looking for any type of obvious assistive device. Another thing that you want to observe for is the presence of what we all know as a positive minor sign. Positive minor sign. Now, a positive minor sign we typically associate with lower back pain and weakness. And a positive minor sign manifests itself as the examinee requiring the use of their hands to get up out of their chair, and this is typically due to lower back weakness and or lower extremity weakness. So a positive minor sign involves the examinee using their hands and climbing up their body with their hands to get to the upright position. So a positive minor sign could be consistent with what's described in Chapter 13 as difficulty rising from deep chairs. That would manifest itself as a positive minor sign. It could also manifest itself as the examinee pushing off the handles of any chair to get up out of the deep chair. Now, what are some other difficulties that examinees could have with deep chairs? How could difficulty with deep chairs manifest itself? Just a couple of examples that you could think of. Well, we have positive minor sign. What about an examinee who's had, imagine an examinee who's had bilateral knee replacements. And because of the knee replacements, they have limited flexion of the knee. Limited flexion. They've lost some flexion. So that's an examinee who cannot get their feet underneath them when they go to get out of a chair, and they require someone to be able to pull them up out of their chair because of loss of flexion of the knee. What about an examinee who perhaps has some ankylosis of one knee and cannot bend the one knee? They may get up and out of their chair with a positive minor sign to get their one leg underneath them to then allow them to stand up. So you want to observe for these various difficulties as the examinee gets out of their chair. Then, as the examinee walks with you back towards the examining room, you want to take your observation of their gait in this narrow window of time and narrow window of space. And this is what many doctors refer to as observing the examinee to move around the office. This qualifies as moving around the office. So as the examinee gets up out of their chair and follows you back to the examination room, I like to have the examinee follow me as I walk backwards so that I can observe them. So they come back to the examination room while I face them and I observe their gait. And I observe their gait with concern, and I observe their gait closely, and they can tell that I'm observing them. And it's during this point that you can ask the examinee some questions. Very simply, you can ask them, are you walking okay? Are you walking okay? Do you have any kind of limp? How's your walk? Do you have any pain with walking? Are you able to walk okay? You interrogate the examinee as to the presence or absence of any assistive device. Now, if the examinee simply says, yeah, I'm walking fine, or they might say, no, I don't have any problem with walking, well, then any kind of formal gait analysis is now over. You've done some observation, You've done some interrogation. The examinee himself does not believe that he has any kind of a gait disturbance. Formal gait analysis is essentially over. Unless later on in the physical examination you come up with some significant objective findings that you believe could interfere with gait, you may then want to investigate in greater depth the gait. But for all intents and purposes, if the examinee himself does not consider that he has any kind of limp or gait disturbance, the gait analysis is basically over. Now, if the examinee says, I have a limp here on my right side, that would signal the need and signal you that you would need to do a formal gait analysis. And what I do is I initiate the formal gait analysis right then. And the formal gait analysis involves the examinee and I either going outside to a long sidewalk or a long parking lot, or somewhere in the building where there's a long stretch of hallway or foyer where I can observe their gait. And I like a distance of at least 30 yards to serve as a representative distance over which we can observe the gait. Now in Chapter 13 talks about long distances, grades, elevations. We really don't have the capacity to assess our examinee under those situations in a qualified medical examination. Now, in certain circumstances, we might be able to observe the examinee to go up and down stairs if there's stairways in the building. But the number of times that I've actually done that are very few. But what we can do is we can at least take the examinee outside and ask them to walk several times back and forth a substantial distance, and I recommend about 30 yards. And by the way, this is not described in the AMA guides at all. This is simply a procedure that I'm recommending to you. And we can observe them to walk up and back 30 yards several times. So I like to have them walk up and back 30 yards at least 3 times. At least 3 times, once while I observe them walking toward me, once while I observe them walking away from me, and once while I observe them walking alongside of me. And I position myself on the side of the affected lower extremity. So if you have an examinee, for example, with left knee replacement, you would position yourself on the left, this is you the doctor, on the left of the examinee, and observe them as you walk with them on the side of involvement. Now, it's during this observation as the examinee goes back and forth several times that you observe the gait disturbance. Now, what's interesting about gait disturbances, and you're going to find this as you become more attuned to spotting gait disturbances out in the general public, what's interesting is that gait disturbances are sometimes easy to spot, but they're not always easy to characterize. It's not always easy to determine exactly what's the cause of it, even though you notice that there is some sort of a gait disturbance. Now, the most typical type of gait disturbance that you're going to see is what the AMA guides refer to as a shortened stance phase. Shortened stance phase. Now, it's beyond the scope of this program to go into gait in any detail, but I do go into gait in great detail in a 3-hour continuing education home study program that's entitled Gait Disturbance and Assistive Devices. It's a 3-hour continuing education home study program that I have for you. So if you have additional interest in the phases of gait, pathologic gait, all the named gait signs and how those manifest, I would recommend that program to you. For our purposes now, let's just talk briefly about the shortened stance phase. Okay? So if you remember back to when you learned about gait, you remember that there's 2 basic phases of gait. There's the time that the foot is on the ground in a weight-bearing position, and then there's the time that the foot is off the ground in the non-weight-bearing position. So we call the time that the foot is in contact with the ground weight bearing. We call that the stance phase, and we call the time where the foot is off the ground non-weight bearing, we refer to that as the swing phase. So we have the stance phase and we have the swing phase. Now, each of these phases have been investigated to the millisecond by researchers and kinesiologists and biomechanists and what have you. Well, for our purposes, we just need to know that there's a stance phase and there's a swing phase. Now, the stance phase can be broken down, and so, for example, we have early stance phase, which we refer to as heel strike. And then we have mid-stance phase, when the weight of the body is vertical over the foot. And then we have late stance phase, which we also refer to as toe off. Well, it's important that you know that the stance phase of gait represents approximately 60% of the time of the cycle of one of each of the lower extremities. So the left lower extremity, for example, spends X amount of time going through stance, through swing, all the way back to the beginning of stance and back to its original starting position in X time. I'm using X just to indicate that that time is variable. Well, 60% of that time, the foot is in some form of the stance phase. Swing phase comprises only 40% of the cycle of the one leg. So the AMA guides refer to a shortened stance phase. With a shortened stance phase, that 60% time increment becomes shortened to perhaps 55%. Or perhaps it gets shortened to 50%, or 45%, or even shorter, and the more and the shorter the stance phase becomes, the more profound and the more obvious is the limp. So I don't know if you've ever had a badly sprained ankle. I have. But you'll know that if you've ever had a badly sprained ankle, you can barely put any weight on that. And so the stance phase looks like and you get off it, and you have to get off it, And stance phase in that situation is just nothing more than a touchdown and a quick transference of weight, maybe 20% of the whole cycle. So we look for a shortened stance phase, and that's one of the things that you're going to look for when you do your observation. So let's say you do identify a shortened stance phase or some other type of gait derangement, and you see that it's there, but you're not exactly sure what's the cause of it or what it is. Well, the good news is you don't have to go it alone, and there's no law that prohibits you from inquiring to the examinee as to the cause of the problem. So you might simply say, what's the cause of that limp? You know, you can ask them, what's going on there? Is that coming from your hip? Is that coming from your knee? Where's the problem? And you enlist the examinee's help in trying to define what is the disturbance of gait. And between the two of you, you should be able to come up with the problem. So the examinee might say, well, it's my knee. When I put weight down on my knee, it hurts and I have to get off of it. And if that makes sense to you, you would ask the examinee to walk back and forth a couple of times while you confirm that indeed that's the cause of the gait disturbance. And you locate it, you identify it, and you become comfortable with observing it, and you become convinced that indeed that is the problem. Once you're convinced between you and the examinee that you've identified the cause of the problem, then you want to capture that disturbance in gait on videotaping, because you're simply not going to be able to remember all the details that you need to later on when it comes time to produce your QME report. So I recommend videotaping it for a couple of reasons, which I'll share with you. So in order to videotape, you do exactly the same procedure. You have the examinee walk towards you and you videotape as they walk towards you. You have the examinee walk away from you and you videotape them as they walk away from you. And then you have the examinee walk alongside of you as you position yourself on the side of involvement, and you capture videotaping as the examinee walks along, down along parking lot and back along parking lot. And you capture videotaping from these three vantage points, focusing in on, in this case, the knee, and capturing the shortened stance phase, the alteration in the swing phase, or whatever the gait disturbance may be. That's step number 4. So we did observation, we did interrogation, we did defining the problem, we captured the problem on videotape. Step number 5 is to review for consistency. Review for consistency. What does that mean? Well, what that means is later on when you're back at your computer and you're preparing your QME report, you review the videotaping. And you review the videotaping making sure that the gait disturbance that you captured is consistent in each one of your tapes, meaning that it's consistent when you see the examinee coming towards you, with the examinee coming away from you. It's consistent with the examinee walking alongside you. You also review it for consistency with the physical examination findings. So, for example, if you had an examinee with a shortened stance phase, that should be associated with some positive physical examination findings on your physical exam, correct? It should be, right? So that's another area where you review the videotaping for consistency. Now, this goes both ways. The videotaping is invaluable if you're going to provide for permanent impairment due to gait disturbance. So let me give you some sample language that you can use in your QME report in the event of an opinion for permanent impairment due to gait disturbance. You might say something like the following, and this goes in your physical examination under the heading of gait evaluation. You might use some language similar to the following. You might say, for the gait evaluation, Mrs. Jones and I went outside to a long parking lot. I observed Mrs. Jones to walk up and back 30 yards while I observed her gait from the front, from the back, and from the side. In each instance, I observed a shortened stance phase due to pain in the right lower extremity, localized at the knee. I have this videotaping available in my library, and it is available at the request of the parties. Now, I've never had the parties request to see my videotaping, but imagine how persuasive, how convincing, how strong your conclusion is when you offer the videotaping to the parties. If they want to see this gait disturbance, you have it captured on videotaping. The videotaping is what you use to rely on for your opinions and conclusions, and you're welcome to see it if you'd like. In other words, you're willing to share it with the parties if they so request. Now, this can go both ways. If you opine against a permanent impairment due to gait disturbance, you might simply say, for the gait evaluation, Mrs. Jones and I went outside to a long parking lot. I observed her to walk up and back 30 yards while I observed her from the front, back, and from the side. In each instance, her gait was normal and unlabored, and I was unable to identify any type of gait disturbance. I videotaped her in each direction, in each position, and I have this videotaping available for the parties upon request. That is a solid opinion for the absence of any type of gait disturbance. So you offer your videotaping to the parties if it's something that they question. Okay? So that's That's observe, interrogate, define, videotape, and review for consistency. A very simple procedure for analyzing and assessing the gait for any type of permanent impairment or for the absence of any type of permanent impairment. Now, you might ask yourself, well, isn't that kind of a cumbersome procedure? Do I actually have to go outside to do this? Isn't that a lot of work? Does that work? Well, I'm here to tell you that I've done this procedure myself hundreds of times. And it's never cumbersome and it's never a problem. And let me tell you that if your examinee actually has a gait disturbance and you take the time to go outside and observe it, to define it with them and characterize what it is, and you capture it on videotape and you provide for permanent impairment for them and you give them the permanent impairment that they're entitled to because of this, they so appreciate you for doing this. They so appreciate your attention to detail, your attention to their detail. So it's neither cumbersome for you or them. If the examinee does not have a gait disturbance, then this procedure is quick, it's over and done with, and then you can proceed on with your regular physical examination procedures. So, doctors, I hope this helps you. Let's go back to the philosophy of this program before we bring it to a close. This program is extracted from a 6-hour continuing education program entitled The 21 Secrets of the Most Persuasive QMEs. And this formal gait analysis lends persuasive power to your physical examination by demonstrating to the examinee that you leave no stone unturned in their physical examination. It demonstrates your persuasion in your QME report because you substantiate your opinion either for or against permanent impairment due to gait disturbance with solid observation and solid procedures, including objective videotaping that captures the examinee actually participating in a gait evaluation. It's so powerful and it's so persuasive, and it's unquestionable when you provide for permanent impairment due to gait disturbance because you have some solid objective findings upon which to base your opinions and conclusions. So doctors, I hope this helps you. This is one of the 21 secrets of the most persuasive QMEs. I encourage you to implement this procedure in your very next examination if in your opinion it's appropriate to do so. So this is Dr. Perry Carpenter. Hope you enjoyed this video and I look forward to being with you on future videos. For now, I'm wishing you best of success in your career as a qualified medical evaluator.